Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about quality, credibility, and validity in qualitative research, and how these concepts are different depending on the paradigm that you're researching from. The concept of validity concerns questions like, what is good research? Who decides what good research is? What criteria do we use to evaluate good research? What is ethical research? Can good qualitative research be unethical, or does one have to be ethical in order to conduct good qualitative research? So when thinking about what is good and valid research, as a field, we have shifted over time from just focusing on methods, for example, doing a good interview or observation, to a focus on process of engagement with your methods and the field. Are you treating participants well? Are you collaborating with participants? Are you conducting your research in an ethical kind of way? And then a shift towards the goodness of your outcomes. What is the purpose of what you're doing? Is it benefiting people? Is it benefiting society? So validity in qualitative research has shifted from just having a focus purely on the methods and the integrity of those methods to a focus on the process and the outcomes. And this is also, of course, associated with the ethics of your research. Another thing about validity and qualitative research is that the criteria that you're going to use is also going to be appropriate to the methodology. So case study, ethnography, phenomenology is all going to be associated with that methodology and the theory that the research paradigm that you're researching under. Speaking of paradigms, let's take a look at the post-positivist sorts of ideas of doing qualitative research, because this is where validity really started for us. In the 1980s, when educational researchers started talking about qualitative research, we started to think about how traditional quantitative validity criteria didn't make a lot of sense for a qualitative. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to think about internal validity of our study and whether or not we can infer causality. It doesn't also make sense for us to talk about external validity and whether or not we can generalize our findings. So if I'm doing a case study of one, I don't really care if my findings generalize to all people that this case might represent. And I certainly don't really care much about reliability or objectivity. So one of the first pieces was written by Lecomte and Goetz, where they kept the same terms that quantitative researchers use. However, they augmented them, and indicating that they have different meanings in qualitative research. So internal validity, external validity meant just something a little bit different. Then a few years later, Lincoln and Guba argued that they didn't really like that. They said, we're doing something different and we want qualitative research to be something different. So they changed the terms. They used terms like credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And you find that those terms, the Lincoln and Guba terms, are the ones that are used now very frequently, especially when people are doing qualitative research that leans more post-positivist, and oftentimes with interpretivism as well. And I put those terms and what they mean at the end of this slide deck. Later, Guba and Lincoln went back to the old validity criteria and said, you know what, maybe we don't like that. Maybe we should be thinking about validity as tied up with ethics. So sort of going further into more interpretivism and constructivism camps, they thought about the importance of being authentic when we conduct our inquiries, asking how can you really trust that what we did was good and fair and valid? And how does our research produce a call to action? Does it inspire change? Does it inspire people to want to do things differently, to be better? And so they proposed a set of criteria that they called authenticity as opposed to validity criteria. These are fairness. Is the research fair? Ontological authenticity. This asks, does the research address what is really going on? And then we have educative, catalytic, and tactical authenticity. And this is where the call to action happens. Are you educating people to do, think, believe differently? And here, by differently, they do mean better. So catalytic authenticity, are you inspiring people to make a change? Are you inspiring them to make schools better, for example? And for tactical, are you giving them the strategies and tools to make those changes? Then in the postmodern fields, we have folks returning to the use of the term validity to continue to circulate it, but to attempt to break it away from its quantitative origins. Here we have the idea of transgressive validities, about transgressing our assumptions about the way the world is and ought to be. One of the more common ones that we see is crystalline validity. So we use the term crystalline as opposed to when a very common concept within more interpretivist constructivist frameworks, and this is triangulation. So the idea of triangulation is that we would have three sources of evidence to prove out the value and validity of our findings. When we think about triangulating theory, we might have three different theories that get us to the same point. Or if we triangulate our methods, we might use three different methods that give us similar answers to the same questions. So I might use interviews, document analysis, and my researcher journal, all to triangulate my findings. However, the problem with this is that it somewhat assumes there is an objective truth that we can triangulate or get closer to. So to counter this with crystalline validity, we think with the metaphor of a crystal. You hold a crystal and look through it, and what you see depends on how you're looking at the crystal. It depends on the angle that you're looking at it from, how you're holding it, where the light hits it, and so on. And so it's not that your perspective is any truer or better, it's just a perspective of several different kinds of perspectives available to you. There's also catalytic validity, and this is similar to Lincoln and Guba's idea of can our research catalyze people to make changes in the world? And then within the critical research field, we've talked about validity as an ethical relationship. And we make it really clear, and now it's quite understood as well within all qualitative research, that one cannot do good, valid qualitative research that is unethical. There's no division between the quality of the study and the ethicality of a study. They are inextricably intertwined. So we talk about things like positionality. What is the position of a researcher vis-a-vis the participants? Polyvocality. Does the research I'm doing represent all of the voices that might have something to say about whatever it is that I'm studying? Critical subjectivity. Am I aware of who I am as a researcher and what my values, beliefs, assumptions are bringing to the research project? And am I leveraging that subjectivity in order to make sense of the research? Reciprocity. Am I giving as much as I'm taking? The sacredness. Are you treating stories or the experiences that people share with you as sacred? Are you sharing privilege? So if your research becomes the next best-selling novel, would you share royalties with your participants? Would you co-author with your participants? Which leads to how we share our power and privilege as researchers with our participants and the community we study as one aspect of critical validity. So the focus on process and outcomes and the ethics of qualitative research, the shift in understanding validity as about the way you do the research to how it's done and the ethics of how it's done. That doesn't mean that there's no quality criteria for methods. There are good ways and not as good ways to do an interview, for example, and there are good ways and not as good ways to do observations. And so we do talk about quality criteria for our methods, but those come specifically from the literature on the methods that you use. And so that's something that you have to talk about when you propose your work to your committees. And on the following 3 slides, I provided Lincoln and Guba's post-positivist criteria and then Tracy's trustworthiness criteria. And these tend to be the most common that we see cited in qualitative dissertations these days. And that absolutely does not mean you have to use and cite it, but I did want you to have it, because ultimately when you propose your dissertation or whatever research study you're going to do, it's your job as a qualitative researcher to explain the validity criteria that should be used to judge the quality of your research. And if you think that trustworthiness and credibility make sense because you're doing an interpretivist study, then those are the criteria that you'll put forward. And just as the set of quality criteria that you use is going to depend on your theoretical and methodological orientation, it's important to remember that they are meant to be engaged. These validity criteria are not a checklist. That's not how we think about validity and qualitative research. They're meant to be thought about, they're meant to be discussed, they're meant to be engaged. Thanks, and see you soon.